Hey, welcome one, welcome all. My name is Karina Martinego, and this is a very brief overview of my past semester in PDHPE. So let's begin by breaking down why PDHPE is an important curriculum area. Pulling straight from the New South Wales syllabus, PDHPE provides and supports what are essentially identifiable as life skills. For example, how to recognize and maintain healthy relationships, concepts of physical and mental well-being, basic movement skills, and community responsibility and safety. However, one line of the syllabus rationale really sticks out. It states PDHPE develops the knowledge, understandings, skills, and attitude important for students in varied and changing contexts. For me, the key language being used here is the idea of ever-changing contexts, as it links to a big part of this semester, which has been 21st century learning, and what that may look like versus how we can prepare for it. With areas such as mental health, gender discourses, sexuality, and physical health now at the forefront of social interest, PDHPE education has never been more important and looks to play an even greater role in the future. While there are a number of different approaches to teaching PDHPE, the past semester has placed the Game Sense approach, or GSA for short, front and center. But what is GSA and what are its benefits as an approach? To help answer our first question, I shall borrow a quote from Light et al.'s 2014 study, which states, "Game sense thinking is a student-centered, inquiry-based approach where the teacher acts as a facilitator of learning rather than a director of it." Building upon this description, I would add that game sense involves students participating in small, modified games wherein, according to Light's 2013 study, stress on technique is reduced to allow players to engage intellectually in the game. So, keeping all of the above in mind, how does it contribute or manifest as beneficial to students? And how does it link to the goals and outcomes of the New South Wales syllabus? Well, in the very first week of this unit, and subsequently throughout, time has been identified as an issue impacting the teaching of PE, specifically the amount of time students are spending being physically active. Rather than explaining and demonstrating desired skills, GSA places student engagement at the forefront, encouraging students to acquire skills through the playing of games, allowing for maximum time spent physically active. The prior then aligns with the movement, skill, and performance strand, as adapting to each game requires students to create and compose movement to achieve specific purposes and performance goals. GSA also ties in nicely with the goals listed under the Health, Wellbeing, and Relationships strand. Both Stolz and Pill's 2014 study and Nijniks et al.'s 2019 study commend GSA for its encouragement of peer collaboration and promotion of open discussion, both of which help build respectful relationships. In addition to the benefits listed prior, Stolz and Pill's 2014 study also makes reference to GSA developing students' abilities to improve and adapt to game-like scenarios based on previous experience. Now that we understand the relevance of PDHPE and the basics of GSA, let's move onward to some reflections. I want to begin by talking about the content and some of the discussions had within the first week of this unit. Admittedly, the first week mostly focused on understanding and utilizing the syllabus, as well as our expectations and pre-existing thoughts and feelings surrounding PDHPE. Our most meaningful conversation happened within our breakout groups, where we discussed a number of agree or disagree scenarios. Of those questions, the two that resonated the most with me and generated the more in-depth discussion were the following. In a crowded curriculum, it's understandable PDHPE is often left out, agree or disagree, and some curriculum subjects are more important than others, agree or disagree. Both of these elicited a very strong response for me, and I found that overall our group was very divided in our opinions. A few members expressed the more generalized opinion discussed by Cadwell et al. That both English and maths should be held as more important than PDHPE and other subjects. Whereas myself and others identify PDHPE as being just as, if not more important, considering its implications to 21st century learning and future generations. Discourses surrounding gender and sexuality have never been more prevalent, and I found I was deeply surprised that some of my peers held such points of view, with them believing that conversations surrounding these topics were unsuitable for the classroom. It wasn't until I started work on the first assignment that I began to realize that these feelings of unease were very common amongst teachers of PDHPE. For example, in an article of John Milton's, it's discussed that a number of generalist teachers simply lacked the knowledge on such topics, therefore do not possess the self-efficacy needed to teach them. hence the reluctance to teach them at all. While the syllabus states that content taught in PDHPE is decided at the individual school's discretion, it also suggests that it is the teacher's responsibility to ensure students receive appropriate and relevant information. I wasn't sure how to interpret these conflicting statements, as instinctively I would want to ensure that my students were receiving a comprehensive PDH experience. Yet I'm well aware that certain topics may receive backlash from the school community. And then you add religion into the mix, it makes it even more difficult. Overall, I think it's an extremely difficult situation, and despite worrying and ruminating over it, I don't know of a solution that could benefit everyone to the highest degree. These may be extremely relevant topics that could deeply affect an individual's identity, but without support of the greater school community, it becomes really hard to teach them. There's also this small seed of doubt that troubles my mind. It's the idea that perhaps I only think these topics are important because these are issues I've had to face as an individual. Overall, it really brought up some fears of my own about how I'm going to go teaching PDHPE in the classroom. Okay, next up, we're going to move on to week 4's tutorial, which is predominantly focused on game sense and how it can be incorporated in practice, as well as some online tools to help incorporate game sense into PE. Reflecting back on my prac, I recall feeling lost and out of my depth when it came to the few PE lessons I had to teach. My mentor teacher at the time defined PE as sport, but not the thoughtful, comprehensive description we see from researchers such as Richard Bailey, rather as a simple outlet for student energy or as an opportunity for the classroom teacher to take a break. So we usually just saw students playing a random game during PE. There was, however, a PE specialist that came in once a week, and while Curry lists the potential benefits of a specialist PE teacher in her 2012 study, a quote from Morgan and Hansen describes a potential weakness of specialist teachers. It reads as follows: the presence of a specialist teacher does not guarantee a quality PE program. During my prac, I was blind to notice that this was the case with the school's PE specialist. Students weren't getting to experience the high engagement opportunities GSA and similar approaches offer. They were just doing drill after drill, not really connecting with or understanding the skills they were meant to be acquiring. Now, before I continue, I want to emphasize here that I was homeschooled. So up until my prac, I hadn't been exposed to PE in a school environment at all. I had nothing to compare everything I was witnessing to. Participating in this week's tutorial made me realize that during my prac, I'd been looking towards these two sets of mentors as my only PE references and attempting to emulate their behaviors and ideals into my own teaching, which was not great, to say the least. I ended up having no focus driving my lessons, and I was misidentifying enjoyment as engagement. I either had students playing games, which they had not yet learnt the appropriate skills to, or they were doing drills that had weak links to syllabus outcomes. Now, not only do I have some references to what good PE practice looks like, but I also know where I can find both the information and tools necessary to conduct and create highly engaging PE lessons. The Playing for Life cards, for example, we looked at, are an amazing resource that I wish I'd had access to earlier. They would have provided the support I was lacking. Overall, this week really had me identifying the mistakes I had both observed and made during my prior teaching practice. Moving on, week 6 was where things really started to hit home for me. This week was in some ways a sequel to week 4, and we further explored what game sense looked like in practice as well as its strengths. Once again, it was within my breakout group that I started to relate the content we were viewing and learning with my past expectations and experiences. The breakout room I was a member of focused on the role of students and dialogic teaching practices in each of the video examples we were required to watch. So in past PE experiences, I will openly admit I did not effectively employ active communication into lessons, or at least not the type encouraged in GSA. What dialogue I did employ was unfortunately teacher-directed, rather than asking open-ended questions to promote discussion amongst students and amongst teams. I would provide direct instruction, which Light et al.'s 2014 study identifies as the complete opposite of good GSA-informed practice. This really limited not only my learning opportunities available to students, but the overall quality and quantity of communication between students. I do think some of the games I had included in my PE lessons had potential. I only wish I had the awareness and knowledge I have now. Coming off the last assignment, this week also had me reflecting on how I promoted social inclusion in the classroom. As mentioned prior, I struggled with differentiating enjoyment from engagement. The videos we reviewed had all students working and communicating consistently, which is not something I promoted during my prac, specifically when it came to my female students. At the time of this tutorial, I had read Bourdieu's theories of habitus and doxa, as well as Clark and Pacter's 2007 study, Hunter's 2004 study, and Bailey's 2005 study. All of them discussed how gender stereotypes limited female participation in PE, and applying that lens to the videos we watched, I could observe how each one had all students engaging and communicating equally. Comparing this to my past PE teaching experiences was extremely disheartening and disappointing. I can recall having some of my female students not receiving equal opportunities to participate, whether that be them removing themselves from the main fray of the game or male peers refusing to pass it to them. The most upsetting part was knowing that I had misguidedly categorized this as girls being girls, not understanding what was actually happening. I'm extremely passionate about gender equality, and so for me, this was a valuable learning opportunity as I desperately want to ensure I'm not carrying these kind of harmful stereotypical ideas into my future teaching practice. Finally, in week 7, we focused on PDHPE teaching and learning strategies, leaning towards encouraging discussion within the classroom. Immediately, the question box strategy stood out as it allowed students to ask questions that they normally may feel too self-conscious or embarrassed to ask, all the while ensuring that the answers were available to all. My personal experience of discussing anything PDH related were very negative. My parents were effectively my teachers, and I always felt far too afraid to ask them any questions for fear that they would judge me or get angry at me. Even during my first prac, I could see some students had questions, but they were hesitant to ask them aloud and would always wait and try and catch me one-on-one before asking because they're afraid of their peers' judgment. Ironically, this kind of thing still happens at university. I believe that introducing these kinds of strategies would also help develop a more open and positive classroom environment. When I look back on my prac, there was very little student discussion and direction in the classroom. And because such an emphasis was placed on being quiet, student discussion was virtually non-existent. While I attempted to encourage and inject this kind of discussion in my prac classroom, it was difficult. Group participation and discussion had been so actively discouraged that students were shut off and reluctant or downright opposed to collaborating with their peers. This week's tutorial made me reflect on this experience and realize that ascertaining a positive classroom environment is not an overnight process. They have to be carefully cultivated and maintained, with lesson structures being carefully considered and all students being equally recognized. With all this focus on positive and open communication, it also reminded me of an event that occurred during my prac regarding some of the difficult topics I referenced at the beginning of this podcast. My prac teacher received a government training package, which essentially included a bunch of information and pamphlets on puberty, and I was excited to have this opportunity to participate in and see how we would be teaching such a topic. Alas, this never happened, as in conjunction with the school principal, they decided to scrap the whole thing due to not knowing how parents would react. It made me think that as a teacher, communication needs to extend beyond the students to the wider community. In my wider degree, we've spoken about Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory and how the wider community affects a child's development. So I think some of these learning strategies could also be used in parent/teacher meeting scenarios to support communication between parents, teachers, and students. Then we might have more ease tackling these difficult topics. So, to conclude this podcast and summarize all my reflections, here's what I've learned this past semester. I've learned a positive PDHP experience depends on a positive classroom environment, and a positive classroom environment requires diligence and consistency. I've also learned that the positive effects of employing game sense approach in PDHPE, and how after identifying that I was not employing GSA in my previous teaching, I can begin using a game sense approach moving forward. And finally, that there is a lot of introspective work needed when teaching PDHPE due to the internalized beliefs that we all develop throughout our lives. These beliefs may affect our teaching both positively and negatively, with or without us being consciously aware of them. I also want to take a moment to express how Bourdieu's theories of practice, habitus, doxa, and so on and so forth really stood out to me this semester. I remember very early on in my bachelor degree, I did a contemporary society unit, which the content focused upon Bourdieu. Seeing that kind of prior learning come back around and how it applies to my career was so fulfilling and really helped me to interpret both my own actions and thoughts, as well as help categorize how students may feel while participating in PDHPE. I started off this semester unsure of myself and my place as a future PDHPE teacher, but open and eager to learn. Overall, I've had a really rewarding and gratifying experience this past semester that has opened my eyes to just how vital PDHPE, and in particular good PDHPE education is. I feel much more confident in my abilities, but more so in the attitude I've developed. I don't want to perpetuate negative or harmful stereotypes in PDHPE. I want my future students to receive a positive PDHPE experience that ensures they become active for life.